Section 31 of the South American Republics, Volume 1, by Thomas Cleland Dawson. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Piotr Natter. Part 4, Brazil. Chapter 8, The Dutch Conquest. By the end of the 16th century, Holland was practically independent, and the "beggars of the sea" were carrying her arms and trade all over the world. Numerous private companies of Dutch merchants made war against Spain on their own account, and great fortunes were made in the capture of Spanish fleets and in trade with Spanish and Portuguese colonies. The Dutch East India Company within a few years possessed itself of the better part of the Portuguese empire in the Indian Ocean, and the West India Company was organized to do the same in South America. Incorporated in 1621, it included various smaller companies already engaged in trade and privateering, and was an immense corporation which finally owned more than 800 ships, and sent to Brazil alone more than 70,000 troops. Although protected, subsidized, and conceded a monopoly by the Dutch Government, it always remained essentially a company for private profit. The company's primary object was to capture the Spanish treasure fleets. Its secondary object was to conquer the possession of Spain and Portugal in South America. Brazil furnished the best base for the operations that were intended to make the South Atlantic a Dutch lake. Bahia and Pernambuco were near Europe, had good harbours, lay on the direct route to the Plate and the Pacific, and from them Africa could be conveniently attacked. The sugar trade was a large thing in itself, and the daring Dutch traders believed that the Portuguese colonists might welcome a deliverance from Spanish domination. Spain's power was a rotten shell, and impulse lying deep in the national spirit pushed the Dutch on to aggression. The peoples of Western Europe had finally felt all the stimulating influences of the Renaissance, of the Lutheran and Jesuit reformations, and of the era of discovery. It was the epoch of the 30 Years' War, of the League of Avignon, and of that confused fighting caused by more vigorous peoples grasping for a share of the spoils of the New World. In 1623 news came of the equipping by the West India Company of an expedition whose destination was manifestly to be Bahia. The Spanish Government took no measures for defence. The local authorities half-heartedly began to fortify the city, but there were no troops except militia to man the works, and when the Dutch fleet hove in sight a panic ensued. The Governor was captured, but many of the inhabitants fled into the back country, and a guerilla warfare was kept up which shut up the Dutch inside the fortifications. They made use of their time in improving the defences, and soon made Bahia the best fortress in South America. The news of the capture created consternation in Lisbon. Great exertions were made by the Portuguese merchants, as well as by the Spanish Government, and the most formidable armament which up to that day had crossed the equator was prepared. It was composed of 52 ships and of 12,000 men, the latter being mercenaries gathered from every country in Europe. The Dutch commander had not yet been reinforced, and made little resistance when such an overwhelming force arrived in Bahia Harbour. He surrendered with the honours of war, and the Spanish fleet retired. In a few weeks another Dutch fleet appeared, bringing provisions and reinforcements. It was too late, however, and the Dutch did not venture to attack an enemy whom they themselves had furnished with such excellent reinforcements. The Dutch, driven from the land, remained undisputed masters of the sea, and the Spanish and Portuguese could no longer trade except in convoys. In 1627 the celebrated Piet Hein, the Dutch Sir Francis Drake, sailed boldly into Bahia Harbour, and despising the fire of the 40 guns of the forts, captured 26 ships within pistol shot of the shore cannon. He ran his own ship right in between the two best Portuguese men of war. The fort did not dare to fire for fear of wounding their own men. The Portuguese flagship was sunk, and the rest surrendered in terror. Among the spoils were 3,000 hogsheads of sugar, which Piet Hein sent home at his leisure, while he ravaged the shores of the bay. The following year he fell in with the Mexican treasure fleet and captured it boldly. This was the greatest capture ever made at sea. The West India Company declared a dividend of 50% after paying the expenses of the unsuccessful Bahia expedition, and resumed its plans of conquest with more vigour than ever. After careful consideration, Pernambuco was selected as a more vulnerable point of attack than Bahia. The fortifications were feeble, and there were numerous Jewish merchants in the city whose friendship could be counted on. Once more the Spanish Government did nothing to avert the threatened blow, and in February, 1630, a Dutch fleet of 50 sail with 7,000 men arrived in front of Pernambuco. 3,000 men were landed to the north of the town, and easily defeated the militia which tried to prevent their taking the place from the rear. The inhabitants fled to the interior, and after a creditable resistance the forts fell. The property captured was estimated at nearly $10 millions. In the meantime, Albuquerque, the Brazilian commander, had retired to a defensible ranch commanding the road between Recife and Olinda, and whence communication could be kept up with the sea by way of Cape St. Augustine. This ranch is celebrated in Brazilian tradition as the "Arraial de Bom Jesus." The Brazilians rallied, and from this vantage ground began to harass the Dutch. The promises of commercial, religious, and political tolerance had produced little effect on the more ardent spirits. The Indians remained faithful to the Portuguese, and with the Negroes did good service in the guerilla warfare. For the first 2 years the Dutch could accomplish little except to improve the fortifications around the town, and the Brazilians acquired a confidence in their own ability to make head against regular troops, which later stood them in good stead. In 1631 a fleet of 20 ships appeared from Spain, but the Dutch admiral sailed boldly out and gave them battle. The net results to the Spaniards were the landing of only 1,000 men, who after some difficulty joined the militia at Bom Jesus. But the seeds of discontent were germinated among the Brazilians. On closer contact the heretics proved to be human. The planters wanted peace and an opportunity to sell their sugar. The Indians, Negroes, and other adventurous spirits composing the guerilla bands robbed both friend and foe. The soldiers were tired of serving without pay. A half-breed named Calabar, a man of remarkable bravery, cunning, and skill in woodcraft, deserted to the Dutch, and gave them valuable assistance. Reinforcements came from Holland, and under Calabar's guidance the Dutch learned the value of ambuscading and made sudden expeditions which took the important settlements by surprise. In 1633 2 special representatives of the Company came with instructions to prosecute the war vigorously, and to endeavour to conciliate the Brazilians. The latter's resistance weakened. Many of Albuquerque's volunteers deserted. The Dutch expeditions up and down the coast were successful. The island of Itamarica, Rio Grande do Norte, Paraíba, and the settlements in Alagoas were successively reduced. Resistance was soon confined to the country just back of Pernambuco itself, and in 1635 the last posts which held out, Bom Jesus and San Agustin, surrendered. The whole coast from the San Francisco River north to Cape San Roque was in the hands of the Dutch. There was nothing for it but submission or emigration. Many laid down their arms, but Albuquerque and his faithful lieutenants, the Negro Diaz and the Indian Camarrao, reluctantly took their way towards Bahia, the only place of refuge. The Brazilian historians claim that 10,000 Pernambucanos, men, women, and children, accompanied Albuquerque, preferring to leave their homes, property, and friends rather than accept the foreign and heretic yoke. A sweet bit of revenge awaited them on their journey. Encountering and overpowering a small Dutch garrison at Porto Calvo, they took its members prisoners, and among them found the traitor Calabar. Him they hanged, while the Dutchmen were let go unharmed. When Albuquerque reached the San Francisco, he was replaced by a Spaniard, Rojas, who had brought reinforcements of 700 Spanish troops. The new commander gave battle to the Hollanders, but in the first action was utterly defeated and lost his own life. For the next 2 years Pernambuco was ravaged by the most frightful burnings and massacres. The Spanish mercenaries and the bands of Negroes and Indians scoured the interior, and the Dutch retaliated with the same methods. The prosperous colony was fast being depopulated and its industries ruined. it became manifest that a policy at once vigorous and conciliatory was necessary, and the Company determined to send out a Governor General with viceregal powers. The merchants of the Directory chose Count John Maurice, of Nassau-Siegen, a scion of the reigning house, and a descendant of William the Silent. A more fortunate selection could not have been made. Though only 32 years old, Count Maurice had already proved himself a brave and skilful soldier. He was a man of culture, a thorough son of the Renaissance, a lover of the arts, and, like most of his house, religiously tolerant and liberal to an extent extraordinary for that bitter age. He was one of those few spirits, in advance of their time, to whom Catholic and Protestant, Jew and Gentile were the same, to whose instincts religious and commercial intolerance was repugnant. He arrived in 1637, and his keen eye at once saw that the two obstacles to pacification were the military raids, which the new Spanish commander, Bagnoli, was directing from his position near the San Francisco, and the fear of the Pernambuco sugar planters that Dutch dominion meant their forcible conversion to Calvinism. The Dutch troops were now well equipped and seasoned for warfare in the tropical woods, and their officers had learned how to exercise their trade under these difficult circumstances with all the coolness, shrewdness, and steadiness of their race. Commanded by Maurice, they easily inflicted a crushing defeat upon the motley crew Bagnoli had been able to gather. The whole country north of the San Francisco fell into Maurice's hands, and he crossed that river and destroyed the Brazilian base of supplies in Sergipe. The next year he was ordered by the Directory to attack Bahia with insufficient forces, and was compelled to retire after a 40 days' siege. 2 years later, however, his fleet defeated and nearly destroyed the largest naval force Spain had sent out since the Invincible Armada. Of the 6,000 soldiers on board who had been expected to drive him from Brazil, only 1,000 were landed, away north of Cape São Roque, whence they barely managed to reach Bahia after a march of over 1,000 miles through the wilderness, suffering the most frightful hardships. Maurice followed up this victory by occupying Sergipe in 1640 and Maranhão in 1641. Ceará had fallen into his hands in 1637. The whole of Brazil from the 3rd to the 12th degree of latitude, a solid body of territory containing more than 2/3 of the population and developed resources, was apparently irretrievably lost to the Portuguese. They only retained Bahia and the isolated settlements in Pará and in the southern provinces. In internal administration Maurice was equally vigorous. He suppressed the exactions of Dutch soldiers and functionaries, and established law, order, and justice. Agriculture, industry, and commerce flourished as never before. He found Recife a miserable port village, and left it a city of 2,000 houses. He does not seem to have made any especial exertions to secure Dutch immigration. The Brazilians were not displaced as landed proprietors, and most of the plantations confiscated from the persistently rebellious were resold to Brazilians who accepted the Dutch rule. He permitted to Romanists and Jews the free and public exercise of their faith. Many Jews came to Pernambuco, and with their characteristic capacity soon became prominent and useful in the commercial life of the colony. The courts were so organized as to secure representation for Brazilians. He summoned a sort of legislature of the principal colonists, the first representative assembly on South American soil, and put into effect the measures it proposed. Local administration was entrusted to Brazilians, and his aim was evidently to make the colony self-governing. But this positivist of the 17th century, this genial pagan who had caught the essential spirit of the Renaissance and had the courage to put it into practice centuries before it became dominant even in the realm of thought, was too far in advance of his time. His countrymen could not understand him or his ideas, and the Portuguese colonists were equally incapable of appreciating what he was trying to do for them. His edifice scattered like a cart house the moment he left. To all appearances every vestige of his work was swept away. It is only a memory and an example, a wave that dashed far up the beach at the beginning of the flood tide, leaving a mark that long served only to show how far the water had once come. It remained for the 19th century and another nation of shopmen to put into practice, on a scale large enough to convince the world, the great principle of non interference by the central government with the religious beliefs and the local self government of colonies. The moneyed aristocrats of the West India Company distrusted Maurice as a member of a reigning family which was maintained in power by its popularity with the masses. The Directory wanted immediate profits, not an empire established on a broad and sure foundation. In their hearts they preferred a steward and bookkeeper to a prince and a statesman. The Calvinist clergy bitterly complained of the liberties conceded their Catholic competitors for tithes, and succeeded in imposing on Maurice the execution of the prohibition against religious processions, then as now so near to the Brazilian heart. Spies were sent out to report on him, and he was continually hampered. Among the Brazilians he was equally misunderstood. While personally so popular that no one of their chroniclers had a word of dispraise for him, they could not forget that he was of a different race and religion, and he did not succeed in converting them to his ideas. His best personal friends were among those most influential, after his departure, in stirring up the exclusive Brazilian feeling. Maurice was not a man to be easily daunted. For 7 years he remained in office, fighting the Directory, the Calvinist ministers, the corrupt officials, trying to reconcile the jealousies between Dutchmen and Brazilians, and to create a homogeneous community. But after the power of the Nassau family began to decline, with the rise of the wheat oligarchy, the Directory determined to be rid of him. In 1644 he made a vigorous demand for more troops, and when it was refused, sent in a Bismarckian resignation, which, to his surprise, was immediately accepted, with many polite protestations of thanks for his services. Section 31.